Before we begin, take a moment to listen, not just to this story, but to the silence around you. The woods you'll hear about tonight are real, and the experiences you're about to step into are drawn from stories people still hesitate to tell out loud. This is Podcast Station, a place where we explore what happens when those who protect the forest come face to face with what lives beyond reason. As you listen, ask yourself one question. If you were out there, alone, would you trust what you hear or what you feel? And when the story ends, tell us in the comments what you believe was watching from the trees. The first time I understood that the forest was listening to me, I was standing alone beneath a ceiling of pine needles, holding my breath because the dark had just breathed back. My name doesn't matter the way people think names do, but I'll give you enough to understand the shape of my life. I was 38 when this started, old enough to have learned restraint, young enough to still believe discipline could keep fear on a short leash. I had been a forest ranger for over a decade, assigned to a stretch of high-elevation national forest, where the pines grow tall and straight and the ground drops away without warning. Locals called it good land, but they said it carefully, the way you talk about a neighbor who smiles too long. They hunted here, camped here, raised their kids to respect it, and they never stayed past nightfall if they didn't have to. I lived where I worked, a small cabin near the service road, far enough from the ranger station that I could hear the wind before I heard engines. The job wasn't glamorous. It was trail maintenance, lost hikers, illegal fires, search and rescue drills that never quite prepared you for the real thing. But I believed in the work. I believed in order, in procedures, in the idea that the forest could be understood if you listened long enough and didn't let your imagination get ahead of your training. That belief lasted until the sounds started changing. At first, it was subtle. The forest always has a voice. Anyone who tells you otherwise has never slept alone in it. Trees creak, branches scrape, wind moves like water through the needles. I knew all of that. I could tell the difference between an elk shifting its weight and a bear pacing. I could tell when snow was coming by the way the air thickened against my skin. What I couldn't explain was the knocking. It began on a late fall patrol, the kind of day where the cold doesn't bite yet but promises it will remember you later. I was hiking a closed trail that skirted a limestone ridge, checking for erosion after a storm. The radio was quiet. Too quiet, I remember thinking, though there was no reason for it not to be. That's when I heard it. 3 sharp knocks, not from any direction that made sense, not echoing the way sound should in that terrain. It wasn't loud. That was the problem. It sounded deliberate, controlled, as if someone had tested the noise first and decided exactly how much of it to give me. I stopped walking. The forest does something strange when you stop like that. The ambient noise doesn't vanish, it leans in. I waited, listening for the follow-up that never came. No footsteps, no laughter, no animal call to explain it away. I told myself it was deadwood shifting, temperature change, stress fracture. I made a note on my pad and kept moving, though my pace had slowed without my permission. The second time it happened, it was closer. Same pattern. 3 knocks. This time I could feel them more than hear them. A vibration in my chest that didn't belong there. I remember placing my hand against the trunk of a pine, feeling the sap harden beneath the bark, grounding myself in something solid. I spoke out loud then, announcing my presence the way we're trained to do. My voice steady, professional. No response. When I got back to the station, I asked one of the older rangers if he'd heard anything unusual near the ridge. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Then he said no, too quickly, and changed the subject. That was my first real mistake. I let him. I told myself that if it mattered, someone would say something. That was the old version of me, the one who thought silence meant safety. The locals were less careful. A week later, a man came in to report missing hunting gear. He was shaking, not from the cold. He said he'd left his pack near a stand and come back to find it moved, neatly arranged against a tree he hadn't been near. He told me he heard knocking while he searched, said it sounded like it was coming from inside the wood itself. I smiled, reassured him, used the words we use when we want people to feel foolish without realizing it. After he left, I sat alone at my desk longer than necessary, staring at the map pinned to the wall. The ridge trail cut across it like a scar. That winter came early. Snow fell heavy and fast, muffling the forest in a way that should have been peaceful. Instead, it made every sound feel intentional. Footsteps were too crisp, branch snaps too sudden, the silence between them pressed down, thick as a held breath. I started sleeping poorly, not because of nightmares, but because of anticipation. I would wake before dawn, heart racing, convinced I'd heard something just outside the cabin. When I stepped onto the porch with a flashlight, the beam caught nothing but drifting snow and the endless vertical lines of trees. It was during a search operation in early January that things escalated. A hiker had gone missing near a series of shallow caves at the base of the ridge. Nothing unusual about that on paper. People overestimate their skills, underestimate the terrain, but the dogs refused to go near the caves. They pulled against their leads, whining, hackles raised. I'd never seen that before. Animals don't spook without reason. They know things we pretend not to. We found the hiker's boots first, placed side by side at the cave entrance, toes pointing inward, no footprints leading away, no signs of struggle, just the boots, clean of snow, as if they'd been set there deliberately after the storm. Inside the cave, the air was wrong, warmer than it should have been, damp, carrying a smell that reminded me of wet stone and old iron. My flashlight beam caught scratches on the walls, deep gouges that didn't match any tool I recognized. The radio crackled once, then went dead. That's when I heard the knocking again. It came from deeper inside the cave, echoing through the stone in a rhythm that matched my pulse before I realized it. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. I felt a pressure behind my eyes, a sudden, irrational certainty that whatever was making that sound then knew I was there and was waiting for me to understand that fact. Training says you don't go deeper without backup. Instinct says you leave. Pride says you don't admit fear until it's too late. I took 1 step forward, then stopped. The sound shifted. It wasn't knocking anymore. It was breathing. Slow. Heavy. Close enough that I could feel it change the temperature of the air against my face. I don't remember deciding to run. I remember being outside, gasping, the snow blinding after the dark. The cave entrance looked unchanged, indifferent to my panic. The rest of the team found me sitting in the snow, unable to explain what I'd heard without sounding unfit for duty. We closed the caves. Officially, it was for safety concerns. Unofficially, everyone avoided that section of forest from then on. The hiker was never found. Locals started whispering again, using old words I pretended not to hear. I told myself I'd face the worst of it, that whatever lived in those pines had shown itself and retreated. That reason had held, even if it trembled. I was wrong. The forest doesn't announce its intentions all at once. It introduces them slowly, the way rot spreads from the inside of a tree, and I was still standing among the pines, still listening, still believing I could understand what was watching me if I paid close enough attention. I tried to convince myself that what happened in the cave was an anomaly, a convergence of stress, isolation, and an imagination sharpened too finely by too many quiet nights. That's how you survive in this line of work, by categorizing fear as an outlier instead of a pattern. But patterns have a way of asserting themselves whether you acknowledge them or not. Spring thaw came late that year. Snow lingered in the shadows, turning trails into slick ribbons of mud and rot. The forest smelled different then, sweet decay layered over cold earth, the kind of scent that settles into your clothes and stays there long after you leave. I spent long days inspecting flood damage, repairing signage, escorting the first wave of seasonal campers who arrived with laughter and optimism that hadn't yet been corrected by experience. It was during one of those routine patrols that sound stopped being my primary warning. I noticed it first through my hands. I was clearing debris near an old fire lookout trail, one that hadn't been used regularly in years. The wood under my gloves felt warmer than it should have been. Not sun-warmed. Alive. I pulled my hand back instinctively, staring at the fallen log as if it might move. It didn't. But when I pressed my palm against a standing pine nearby, I felt the same subtle heat, faint but unmistakable, like the afterglow of a body that had just stood up and walked away. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Sap flow, microclimate variance, decomposition. But my body didn't care about explanations. My pulse had quickened. My breath came shallow. Touch had betrayed me in a way sound never had. It wasn't something I could unhear or misinterpret. It was direct, intimate. That night, the temperature dropped suddenly. Frost crept back over the ground, sealing the mud in a thin, brittle skin. I lay awake in my cabin, listening to the familiar chorus of night insects fade as the cold deepened. Somewhere after midnight, I became aware of another sensation. Pressure. Not physical at first, more like the sense of being watched so intensely it leaves a residue on your skin. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the flashlight. I told myself that if I acknowledged it, I'd be giving it permission. The pressure grew heavier. Then came the smell. It seeped in through the cracks around the door, through the chimney flue, thick and metallic. Not smoke, not decay. It reminded me of blood on cold stone, of rain hitting rusted iron. My stomach clenched. I sat up, heart hammering, every instinct screaming that something was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. There was a shape outside the cabin window. I didn't see it all at once. My eyes traced the absence first, the way darkness pooled unnaturally against the glass. Then I saw movement. Not a step, not a shift, but a subtle reconfiguration, like the outline of something adjusting itself to my gaze. It was tall. Too tall. The top of it extended beyond the window frame, forcing me to imagine the rest of it towering above the cabin roof. I couldn't make out details. The glass fogged slightly where it stood closest, as if its presence alone altered the air. The knocking started again, not on the door, on the walls, slow, measured. One knock at a time, moving around the cabin in a deliberate circuit. I counted them without meaning to. 3 on the east wall, 3 on the south, 3 on the west. It stopped at the door. I found myself whispering, pleading with something that had never promised mercy, promising that I would leave, that I would stay out of the forest if that's what it wanted. The words tasted like betrayal. This land was my responsibility, my identity. And yet, faced with whatever stood outside, those concepts felt thin, easily torn. The door handle turned, just enough to test it. The sound snapped something in me. I grabbed the radio, shouting into it despite knowing there was no one awake to answer. Static answered back, laced with a low-frequency hum that made my teeth ache. The smell intensified. I retched, barely managing to keep myself upright. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. No knocking, no pressure, no smell. When dawn finally came, pale and hesitant, I stepped outside with a weapon I'd never needed before. The ground around the cabin was undisturbed. No footprints, no broken branches. The forest stood as it always had, indifferent and towering. I told no one what happened. Not then. Admitting it would have meant confronting the truth that I was no longer in control, that the forest I thought I understood had decided to correct me. Instead, I threw myself into work. Longer patrols, deeper hikes. I avoided the caves, but found myself circling the ridge again and again, drawn by something I couldn't name. That's when I started finding the markers. Small arrangements of stones at trail intersections. Branches woven together in patterns that hurt my eyes to follow for too long. Scratches on trees, higher than any bear could reach, spiraling upward until they vanished into the canopy. And always, the sense of being observed. The locals noticed the change in me before my colleagues did. They stopped asking me questions, stopped meeting my gaze. One woman pressed a small carved token into my hand one morning, her fingers trembling. She told me it was for protection, that her grandmother had warned her about the spirits of the pines when she was a child. I tried to give it back. She refused, tears welling in her eyes. They don't like caves, she said quietly, but they live near them. That night, I dreamed of stone closing in around me, of breath echoing through tunnels too narrow to escape. I woke with dirt under my nails and the distinct impression that I had been somewhere I didn't remember traveling to. The forest was no longer just an environment. It was an adversary that knew my routines, my weaknesses, my stubborn refusal to leave. And I was beginning to understand that whatever haunted those pines wasn't content with observation anymore. It was teaching me something, lesson by lesson, carving away at the certainty that had once made me feel safe. I just didn't know yet how far it was willing to go to make sure I learned. By early summer, sleep had become a negotiation I always lost. I would drift off from exhaustion and wake minutes later, convinced I'd heard my name carried on the wind. Not shouted, not whispered, spoken plainly, the way someone says your name when they're standing just behind you and want you to turn around. I stopped trusting my instincts, which is a dangerous thing for a ranger to do. Every alarm bell in my body rang constantly now, and when everything feels like a threat, you start dismissing real danger out of spite. I told myself the stress was catching up to me, that isolation had finally worked its way under my skin. I even considered requesting a transfer, but the thought filled me with a quiet shame I couldn't explain. Leaving felt less like retreat and more like abandonment, of the forest, of the people who trusted me, and of something else I wasn't ready to name. It was a call from dispatch that pushed me past the point of rational denial. 2 teenagers hadn't checked in after an overnight hike. Their car was found near an unofficial trailhead, one that locals used but we never advertised. The trail led straight toward the ridge and the caves. Of course it did. Everything always led back there eventually, like water finding the lowest point. I joined the search team out of obligation and something darker, a need to prove that I was still capable, still grounded in reality. The day was oppressively warm, the air thick and unmoving. Sweat soaked through my uniform within minutes, carrying that same metallic scent I'd begun to associate with unease. The forest was quiet in a way that felt staged, as if it were holding something back. We split into pairs. I volunteered to check the western slope alone, citing familiarity with the terrain. No one argued. They rarely did anymore. As I climbed, the temperature dropped sharply. Goosebumps rose along my arms despite the heat. The trees grew denser, their trunks crowding closer together, branches interlacing overhead until the light thinned to a greenish haze. My radio crackled intermittently, never long enough to form words. That's when I heard the footsteps. They matched mine perfectly. Same pace, same rhythm. When I stopped, they stopped. When I shifted my weight, I heard the faint crunch of leaves doing the same behind me. I didn't turn around at first. I told myself it was an echo, a trick of sound in the enclosed space. But sound doesn't breathe, and whatever followed me was breathing, slow and deep, as if it had all the time in the world. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing, just trees. Endless, identical trees. But the air felt compressed, heavy against my chest. I forced myself to keep moving, every step an act of will. That's when I noticed the silence wasn't complete. There was a low humming beneath it, a vibration that resonated in my bones more than my ears. I found the first backpack near a cluster of boulders. It was torn open, its contents neatly arranged on the ground. Water bottle, map, phone. The phone screen was cracked, but still powered on. No signal, no missed calls, just one open photo. It was a picture of the trees, not a scenic shot, not framed or intentional. It looked accidental, tilted, taken in haste. But in the center of the image, partially obscured by shadow, was a shape that didn't belong. Tall, broad-shouldered, its outline blurred, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on it. 2 pale reflections marked where eyes should have been. My hands shook as I pocketed the phone. I called it in, my voice strained but steady enough to pass. I didn't mention the photo. I don't know why. Maybe part of me was still hoping there was a version of events that didn't involve what I was thinking. The humming grew louder as I approached the caves. I could smell them before I saw them. The same damp stone, the same iron tang. The cave entrance yawned open between two leaning pines, wider than I remembered, its shadow deeper and more absolute. I felt drawn to it, pulled by a pressure behind my sternum that made it hard to breathe. That's when I heard a voice. Help! It came from inside the cave, faint and hoarse. A young voice. Terrified. Training took over. Fear receded just enough to let procedure kick in. I called out, identifying myself, telling whoever was inside to stay where they were. The voice answered again, closer this time, repeating the word like it was the only one left. I took a step forward. The smell intensified. The humming resolved into something almost like chanting, layered and overlapping. I realized then that the voice wasn't moving toward me. It was changing, deepening, stretching the word until it no longer sounded human. Help, it said again, and this time it knew exactly how to say it so my body would respond before my mind could stop it. I backed away, every nerve screaming. The ground beneath my feet vibrated. Small stones skittered toward the cave entrance as if pulled by a current. From the darkness, something shifted. Mass displacing air, presence announcing itself without apology. I caught a glimpse of it then. Not fully, never fully, but enough. It was enormous, its outline filling the cave mouth. Its limbs were too long, joints bending at wrong angles. Its surface looked like a patchwork of shadow and bark and matted hair, as if the forest itself had tried to assemble a body and gotten impatient. When it moved, the sound wasn't footsteps, but the grinding of wood under pressure. Its eyes were wrong, not glowing, reflective, like deep pools catching the light and bending it inward. I ran. I don't remember the path I took, only the sensation of the forest blurring past, branches clawing at my face, roots reaching for my ankles. Behind me, the humming rose into a roar, shaking leaves loose from the canopy. I could feel its pursuit not as distance, but as inevitability, a closing gap in the air itself. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The pressure vanished. The sound cut off mid-vibration. I collapsed against a tree, lungs burning, vision swimming. When I dared to look back, the forest had returned to its earlier stillness, as if nothing had passed through it at all. The teenagers were never found. Officially, the case remains open. Unofficially, everyone knows where not to look. I filed my report carefully, choosing words that would protect me from scrutiny and still convey enough urgency to close the area permanently. The caves were sealed, trails rerouted, signs posted that no one reads. But sealing a cave doesn't bury what lives in it. Since that day, I've stopped pretending the forest is neutral. I understand now that it remembers, that it keeps what it takes. I still patrol, I still protect, but I do it with the knowledge that reason is fragile out here and that some spirits don't haunt, they endure. And every time the wind shifts just right and carries a sound that almost forms my name, I remind myself of the lesson it's been teaching me all along. Survival isn't about conquering fear. It's about recognizing when the forest has decided you're close enough to listen. After that summer, the forest stopped testing me with spectacle. No more towering shapes at cave mouths, no voices calling for help, no knocking that traced the perimeter of my cabin like a patient hand. That should have been a relief. Instead, it was worse. What replaced it was subtle, persistent, and far more corrosive. It began with memory. I would walk a trail I'd hiked 100 times and feel a sudden, sharp uncertainty, like stepping into a room and forgetting why you're there, only magnified by miles of wilderness and responsibility. Landmarks felt unfamiliar. Turns I knew by muscle memory hesitated under my boots. Once I followed a switchback that should have led me to a creek overlook, and instead found myself standing in front of the sealed cave entrance. My hands numb, my watch insisting that 3 hours had passed without my consent. I started leaving markers for myself, small things at first. A strip of orange tape tied low on a branch, a stone balanced deliberately where it wouldn't be mistaken for chance. Notes scribbled in a pocket notebook. You turned east here. You rested here. Do not go past this point. Sometimes I found the markers moved. Not destroyed, not erased, improved. The tape retied higher, the stones stacked more carefully than I had the patience for. Once, I opened my notebook to find a line added beneath my own handwriting, pressed so deeply into paper it tore the fibers. "You listen slowly." I told myself if I'd written it and forgotten. That was the only explanation that didn't end my career on the spot. But my denial felt thin now, stretched past usefulness. Deep down, I understood that whatever lived in those pines no longer needed to chase me. It had learned me, my habits, my thoughts, my resistance. The locals began treating me differently too. Not with fear, with something closer to reverence or maybe resignation. They stopped warning me, stopped offering charms and stories. Instead, they asked questions they already knew the answers to. Does it still follow you? Does it let you leave? One man, a trapper who'd lived on the forest edge longer than I'd been alive, finally said what no one else would. He told me the caves weren't homes. They were mouths. Openings where the forest exhales what it can't keep buried anymore. He said the spirits weren't evil, not in the way people wanted them to be. They were custodians, balances, and they didn't like being watched. That night, I dreamed of the cave again, but this time, I wasn't running. I stood at the entrance, the stone warm beneath my bare hands. The humming wasn't threatening. It was rhythmic, almost patient. When the shape emerged from the darkness, it didn't loom. It crouched, folding itself down to meet my eye level. Up close, it was worse, not because it was monstrous, but because it was layered. I could see impressions in its surface, shapes that looked like faces pressed from the inside, half-remembered, unfinished. When it spoke, it didn't use sound. It used memory. I felt the weight of every footstep I'd taken in the forest, every fire I'd put out, every body I'd helped recover, every name I'd written in a report and never said out loud again. The forest wasn't accusing me. It was reminding me of the cost of attention, of the cost of protection. I woke with tears on my face and dirt under my nails again. That was when I understood the final lesson. I wasn't being hunted. I was being kept. Rangers come and go, transfers happen, retirements, accidents. But the forest remains, and it remembers the ones who listen too closely, the ones who learn its patterns, not just on maps, but in their bones. The caves weren't calling victims. They were anchoring witnesses. I requested my transfer the following winter. Official reasons: health, stress, reassignment needs. No one questioned it. On my last day, I walked the perimeter one final time, stopping short of the ridge. I didn't need to go back to the caves to know they were there, breathing steadily beneath the stone. As I turned to leave, the wind moved through the pines in a way I recognized, not as threat, not as warning, but as acknowledgement. A pressure, brief and gentle, like a hand between my shoulder blades guiding me forward. I live far from that forest now, somewhere flatter, louder, safer by most definitions. But safety has never meant distance. It means understanding what follows you and why. Sometimes when night settles just right and the air grows still, I catch a scent that doesn't belong. Cold stone, old iron. And I remember that reason is fragile, that darkness doesn't need permission to exist, and that some stories aren't meant to be solved, only carried. The spirits of the pines are still there. The locals still whisper. And if you ever find yourself near a sealed cave, listening to a sound that feels like it's listening back, do yourself a favor. Don't knock. I used to think the silence was a gift. That's the first lie they tell you when you put on the badge and the Loden green uniform. They tell you the isolation is a cleanse, a way to scrub the static of the city out of your marrow. But out here, in the throat of the Olympic Peninsula, the silence isn't an absence of noise. It's a presence. It's a heavy, pressurized thing that pushes against your eardrums until you start hearing the internal mechanics of your own body, the wet thud of your heart, the sliding of muscle over bone. And then, once you're tuned into that frequency, the forest starts filling in the gaps. My name doesn't matter anymore. To the Department of the Interior, I'm a line item on a pension fund I'll never collect. To the locals in the gray-skied towns bordering the park, I was just another tree cop who looked a little too long into the tree line. I took this post 8 years ago, fleeing a marriage that had withered into a series of polite silences and a tragedy I still can't put into words without feeling like I'm swallowing glass. I wanted a place where the stakes were simple: fire, gravity, and animal instinct. I wanted a world where things died for a reason. But the wilderness doesn't care about your reasons. It started in late October, the year the frost came early and stayed like a shroud. I was stationed at the Blackwood Lookout, a high-altitude post that oversees a valley the Makah tribes used to avoid, a place they called the rib cage because of how the white-barked hemlocks curved inward over the valley floor. The air had turned brittle, smelling of ozone and wet slate. I was doing my evening log when I saw it. It was standing just past the perimeter of the station's floodlights. An elk. A Roosevelt bull, massive and heavy-chested, its rack wide enough to bridge a narrow creek. It didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilted at an angle that looked wrong, like it was trying to listen to something happening 5 feet underground. I grabbed my binoculars, thinking it might be injured or suffering from chronic wasting disease. The light hit its face, and my stomach did a slow, cold roll. It didn't have eyes, not just blinded. The sockets were gone. In their place was smooth, unbroken hide, as if the skin had grown right over the bone without ever leaving a gap for sight. There was no scarring, no blood, just a seamless, velvety mask of fur where the windows to the soul should have been. I watched it for an hour. It didn't graze. It didn't scent the air. It just rotated its head with a slow, mechanical precision, tracking me. Even without eyes, it knew exactly where I was behind the glass of the observation deck. When the wind shifted, the smell hit me. Not the musky, wild scent of a cervid, but the cloying, synthetic sweetness of lilies in a funeral parlor, underpinned by a sharp metallic tang, like copper pennies on a tongue. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my Remington 700 across my knees, watching the thermal feed. The screen showed the forest in shades of cold blue and gray, but the spot where the elk stood was a white-hot bloom of heat, too hot for a mammal. It stayed there until the sun began to bleed through the fog, and then it simply wasn't there anymore. No hoofprints in the frost, no broken twigs. Just a mutation, I told the empty room. My voice sounded thin, like paper tearing. Radiation, maybe, or a localized genetic fluke. I'm good at rationalizing. It's a survival mechanism. You have to be when your job involves finding point-last-seen markers for hikers who vanish in broad daylight, leaving nothing behind but a pair of neatly laced boots and a camera full of black photos. I remembered a boy 3 years back, Caleb, 7 years old. He'd gone missing in a meadow while his father was tying a shoelace. We searched for 6 weeks. We found his jacket 3 miles up a sheer rock face no professional climber would touch without gear. It was turned inside out and zipped up to the chin, but there was no boy inside, no blood, just the smell of those damn lilies. The second night, the elk was closer. It was standing on the gravel path leading to the generator shed, maybe 20 feet from my door. This time, it wasn't alone. It was standing next to a park bench, and its posture was different. It was mimicking the way a human sits. It had collapsed its hind legs in a way that defied its anatomy, its front hooves resting on the wooden slats like a tired hiker taking a break. The most unsettling part wasn't the eyeless face. It was the sound. It started as a low-frequency hum that vibrated the floorboards of the station. It escalated into a series of clicks, rapid fire, like a Geiger counter in a hot zone. And then, a voice. It wasn't a voice I recognized, but it was human. It sounded like a recording of a radio broadcast from the 1950s, crackling with static. Heavy snowfall expected in the pass. Please stay indoors. The water is fine. The water is fine. It repeated that last phrase 100 times, the pitch shifting until it sounded like my own mother's voice. My mother has been dead for 12 years. I didn't open the door. I did what any rational officer would do. I radioed dispatch. Dispatch, this is Lookout 4. I have a situation. Possible poached or diseased wildlife at the perimeter. Requesting a bio team or a warden with a tranquilizer kit. The radio hissed. The static was thicker than usual, a chaotic wall of white noise. Then a voice broke through. It wasn't the dispatcher. It was a man, sobbing. "I can't find the zipper," the voice wailed. "I'm inside out, and I can't find the zipper." I dropped the hand mic. The hum outside stopped. I looked out the window, and the elk, the thing, was gone. In its place, leaning against the park bench, was a small red child's jacket. It was zipping and unzipping itself over and over with a rhythmic, metallic shur that echoed in the cold air. The paranoia began to set in then, a slow-acting poison. I started wondering if the other rangers knew. I thought of Miller, the veteran who'd retired 6 months early after a fall in the High Divide. He'd stopped talking entirely in his last weeks, spent all his time staring at the topographic maps with a magnifying glass, tracing the cave systems that weren't supposed to exist. He'd left me his compass. When I pulled it out of my drawer that night, the needle wasn't pointing north. It was spinning in a slow, hypnotic circle, as if the very poles of the earth had lost their grip. I realized then that the forest wasn't just a collection of trees and dirt. It was a machine, a vast, organic engine fueled by the things it swallowed, and I was just another piece of grit in the gears. I spent the next 3 days in a fever of activity. I cleaned my rifle 4 times. I checked the perimeter fence. I mapped the blind spots in the valley where the shadows seemed to linger even at noon. I found 3 more of those smooth-skinned elk in the woods during my patrols. They weren't hiding. They were watching. They stood behind the trunks of Douglas firs, their eyeless faces peeking out just enough to be seen. They moved with a jerky, stop-motion gait, appearing 30 yards closer every time I blinked. By the 4th night, the temperature in the station dropped to 40 below, despite the heater screaming at full blast. Frost began to form on the inside of the glass, but it didn't form in crystalline patterns. It formed letters, symbols, a language of jagged lines that seemed to writhe when I looked away. I knew I had to leave. I had to get to my truck and drive until the trees turned into skyscrapers. But when I reached for the door handle, I heard a soft tapping on the wood. Knock. Knock, knock, knock. It was a ranger's signal, the all-clear tap we use when we're approaching a cabin at night. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "It's Miller," the voice replied from the other side. "I forgot my compass, kid. It's cold out here. Let me in." Miller died in a hospice ward 3 weeks ago. I'd seen the obituary. "You're not Miller," I whispered, backing away. "I'm whoever you need me to be," the voice said, and the tone dropped an octave, losing all its human warmth. "But you really should check the generator. The smell is getting ripe." I turned to the window. The elk was back. It was standing directly under the floodlight, and this time it was opening its mouth. It didn't have teeth. It had rows of human fingers, pale and wiggling, lining its throat like the cilia of an anemone. The hum started again, but this time it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the floorboards, from the walls, from inside my own chest. The vibration in my rib cage became a physical weight, a density that made it hard to draw a full breath. I didn't look back at the door. I didn't look at the Miller thing that was tapping with an increasingly frantic, rhythmic persistence. I looked at the elk. The fingers in its throat were beckoning, a rhythmic, undulating wave of pale skin that seemed to pulse in time with my own quickening pulse. I realized then that the smell the voice mentioned wasn't coming from the generator shed. It was coming from the vents. A thick, oily stench of old copper and wet, matted fur began to pour into the cabin. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse that had been left to bake in the sun, then suddenly frozen solid. I felt my stomach flip, the bile rising hot in my throat. I grabbed my pack, the one I'd kept staged by the door for a bug-out scenario I'd always joked about with the guys at the district office. My hands were shaking so violently I nearly dropped my keys. I didn't take the front door. I couldn't. Whatever was standing there, wearing Miller's voice like a stolen coat, was waiting for that specific invitation. I smashed the rear window of the observation deck with the butt of my Remington. The glass shattered with a sound like a gunshot in the pressurized silence. I scrambled out onto the emergency catwalk, the sub-zero air hitting me like a physical blow. The frost on the metal was black, slick as oil. Below me, the forest was alive, not with the movement of wind or the scurrying of nocturnal life. It was a synchronized shifting. The trees, the massive centuries-old hemlocks, were leaning. They were tilting in unison toward the station, their roots groaning under the soil like the cables of a suspension bridge under strain. In the strobe light flicker of the dying generator, I saw dozens of them, not just elk. There were things that looked like bears but had too many joints in their limbs, moving with the fluid, horrific grace of a centipede. There were coyotes with human faces stitched onto their skulls, their mouths sewn shut with silver wire. They weren't attacking. They were waiting. I slid down the ladder, my boots hitting the frozen dirt with a dull thud. I didn't head for the truck. The truck was a trap, a metal box that would become a coffin the moment I turned the key. I headed for the dead man's trail, a narrow, unofficial path that cut through a limestone gorge and led toward the old mining sector. It was dangerous ground, prone to sinkholes and rock slides, but it was the only direction the things weren't gathered. As I ran, the forest began to play with my depth perception. One moment, the trees were miles apart. The next, they were crowding in, their bark feeling like cold, damp skin as I brushed past. The hum followed me. It wasn't a sound anymore. It was a physical sensation, a localized earthquake that stayed exactly 10 feet behind my heels. "Wait," a voice whispered from a hollow log. It was my ex-wife's voice. "You forgot the keys, Sarah. You always forget the keys." I didn't stop. I couldn't. I knew if I looked into the hollow, I wouldn't see her. I'd see a mouthful of fingers or a face with no eyes. I reached the entrance of the Boreas mine around 3 a.m. The mine had been sealed in the 50s after a tectonic event that the government had scrubbed from the local records. The heavy steel doors were supposed to be welded shut, but as I approached, I saw they were peeled back like a tin can, not rusted through, bitten. The thick iron was jagged, showing teeth marks that were easily 3 inches wide. I ducked inside. The air was warmer here, but it was a sickly, humid heat. It smelled of sulfur and that damn funeral lily scent. I flicked on my tactical light. The beam cut through the dark, revealing walls that weren't just rock. They were covered in a translucent resinous film. It looked like hardened sap, but when I touched it, it was warm. It throbbed. I followed the main drift deeper into the mountain, my mind fracturing. I started talking to myself, a desperate attempt to maintain a tether to reality. Limestone, 47 degrees latitude, igneous intrusion. You are a ranger. You are an officer of the law. This is just a localized. The words died in my throat. The tunnel opened into a massive central chamber, a cathedral of stone that shouldn't have existed. In the center was a structure that looked like a biological radio tower. It was composed of twisted antlers, bleached white bones, and miles of what looked like copper wiring stripped from the old mine's infrastructure. And at the base of the tower were the missing. I saw Caleb. He was standing there, 3 years older than the day he vanished, but his skin was the color of a mushroom. He wasn't moving. He was part of the structure. His arms were fused into the antler lattice, his fingers elongated and twitching, the same fingers I'd seen in the mouth of the elk. He wasn't dead. His eyes were wide open, and they were glowing with a soft bioluminescent green. He looked at me, and his jaw unhinged, dropping further than humanly possible. "The water is fine," he said. His voice was a chorus, 1,000 voices overlapping, a tidal wave of sound that knocked me to my knees. "The land remembers, Sarah. It remembers being whole before you crawled out of the mud." I scrambled backward, my light sweeping the room. There were dozens of them, hikers from the 70s, loggers from the turn of the century, all woven into the walls, their bodies becoming the architecture of something ancient and hungry. Then I saw the elk. It was standing on a ledge above the boy, but it wasn't an animal anymore. It was shedding. The hide was splitting down the spine, revealing something pale and glistening underneath, something with too many ribs. It stepped out of its own skin like a man stepping out of a suit. It was a spindly, translucent thing, its organs visible through its chest, and they weren't organs, they were gears, clockwork made of bone and gristle, turning in a slow, agonizing grind. It looked down at me, and for the first time I saw its eyes. They weren't in its head. They were embedded in the palms of its long, needle-thin hands. It clapped its hands together, and the world went white. I woke up 3 miles away, lying in the snow outside the park boundaries. My uniform was gone. I was wearing a red child's jacket that was 3 sizes too small. My hands were stained with a black, oily resin that wouldn't wash off, no matter how hard I scrubbed. I walked to the nearest highway, flagging down a logging truck. The driver looked at me with a terror I'll never forget. He didn't ask if I was okay. He just drove in silence, his eyes fixed on the road, his knuckles white on the wheel. When I finally looked in the rearview mirror, I didn't see my own face. I saw a smooth, velvety mask of skin. No eyes, just the reflection of the forest behind us, growing, stretching, and waiting for the next person to think that the silence was a gift. I'm in a motel now, somewhere in Nevada. The desert is supposed to be safe. It's open. No trees, no shadows to hide in. But this morning, when I turned on the faucet, the water didn't come out clear. It came out smelling of lilies. And just now there was a knock on the door. Knock, 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 knock. Sarah, Miller's voice says through the wood. Open up. You left the compass in the mine. We need it to find the zipper. I'm looking at the door. I'm looking at the 12 gauge on the bed. And I'm starting to think, maybe the water is fine. The 12 gauge felt like a toy in my hands. It didn't belong to the world I was currently inhabiting, a world where physics had become a suggestion and biology was a cruel joke. I didn't open the door. I didn't even look through the peephole. I knew that if I did, the fisheye lens would only show me an infinite stretch of green hemlocks where the motel hallway should be. Go away, I whispered. My voice was a dry rattle. We can't, the voice replied. It wasn't just Miller now. It was a cacophony. It was Caleb. It was my mother. It was the sound of wind through a canyon and the scream of a rabbit caught in a snare. The circuit is open, Sarah. You brought the frequency with you. You're the antenna now. I looked at my hands. The black resin I'd noticed earlier wasn't just a stain. It was moving. Fine, obsidian threads were pulsing beneath my skin, tracing the paths of my veins, turning my circulatory system into a map of the Boreas mine. I felt a sharp, rhythmic ticking in my wrist, not a heartbeat, but the cold, mechanical grind of those bone gears I'd seen inside the shedding thing. I realized then that I hadn't escaped the mine. The mine had simply expanded its borders to include me. I threw my gear into the truck and drove. I didn't have a destination. I just needed velocity. I thought if I moved fast enough, I could outrun the transmission. I drove through the night, the desert floor blurring into a gray smear under the moon. But the environment was changing. The sagebrush began to curve inward, the twisted wood beginning to resemble rib cages. The sand under my tires started to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that made the dashboard plastic rattle until it cracked. Around 4 a.m., the headlights caught something in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck fishtailing in the grit. It was the elk. It was standing in the center of the loneliest road in America, hundreds of miles from its habitat. It wasn't the shedding thing anymore. It was back in its skin, but the skin was stitched together with heavy industrial staples. Its eyeless head was tilted back, staring at the stars, or maybe it was feeding on them. I didn't try to go around. I grabbed the Remington and stepped out of the cab. The heat of the Nevada desert had vanished. A localized blizzard was howling around the truck, the snowflakes hitting my skin and burning like dry ice. The smell of lilies was so thick I could taste it, a cloying floral rot that coated the back of my throat. "What do you want?" I screamed into the wind. The elk didn't move its mouth. The sound came from the truck's radio, which I had turned off miles ago. Observation, the radio crackled. We are documenting the breakdown of the individual unit, the way the mind tries to build a bridge over the abyss using bricks made of logic. It's fascinating, Sarah. You're still trying to use a gun. You're still trying to use a name. The elk began to walk toward me. Its hooves didn't make a sound on the asphalt. It moved in that horrific, frame-skipping way, appearing 10 feet closer every time the wind whipped snow across my vision. I am a ranger, I growled, leveling the rifle. I am an officer of the law. You are a witness, the radio corrected, and a witness is just a vessel for a memory that doesn't belong to you. I fired. The .30-06 round struck the elk square in the chest. There was no blood. The wound opened to reveal a hollow interior lined with rows of glowing green eyes, human eyes all blinking in unison. They weren't looking at me. They were looking through me, at something standing right behind my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just my own shadow, cast long by the headlights. But my shadow wasn't moving with me. It was standing still, its arms raised in a gesture of prayer or surrender. My shadow had eyes. The ground beneath the truck began to liquefy. The asphalt turned into a black, bubbling tar that smelled of ancient peat and jet fuel. The truck began to sink, the metal groaning as it was swallowed by the earth. I tried to run, but the air had become viscous, like I was moving through a vat of honey. I fell to my knees, the frost burns on my face stinging. I looked back at the elk. It was standing over me now, its massive rack silhouetted against the moon like a crown of thorns. It leaned down, its eyeless face inches from mine. I felt a cold pressure on my chest. It wasn't a hoof, it was a hand. A pale, needle-thin hand emerging from the elk's throat, its palm eye staring directly into mine. "Do you remember the zipper now?" it whispered. The world tilted. The desert floor fell away, and I was back in the mine. But it wasn't the mine as I'd seen it before. It was a laboratory, a bunker, a temple. The walls were lined with monitors, all of them showing different parts of the forest. I saw Miller sitting at a desk, his back to me, his hands moving with mechanical precision as he typed on a keyboard made of teeth. I saw Caleb, still woven into the wall, his green glow illuminating a series of maps that showed the entire Pacific Northwest as a single giant organism. "It's a harvest," I whispered, the realization crushing my mind like a vice. The disappearances, the glitches, the mimicry. It wasn't a haunting. It was a management system. We were the livestock, and the wilderness was the slaughterhouse floor, designed to keep us confused and isolated until we were ripe enough to be integrated. Miller turned around. His face was gone. In its place was a mirror. I saw myself, not as I am, but as I was becoming. My skin was turning into that smooth, eyeless velvet. My fingers were elongating. "You did well, Sarah," the Miller thing said, its voice now completely synthesized. "Most of them break during the first week. You lasted 4. Your trauma has a very high yield. The land will find it very nourishing." He reached out and touched my forehead. His touch was a vibration that shattered the last of my sanity. I felt my memories being pulled out of my skull like strands of silk. My marriage, the smell of my first dog, the sound of my father's truck, the grief over Caleb. All of it was being fed into the antler tower, converted into the hum that kept the forest alive. I tried to scream, but my jaw had already fused. I felt the first of the staples being driven into my spine. I'm writing this now on a piece of parchment that feels suspiciously like dried skin. I don't know where I am. The geometry of this place doesn't make sense. I can see the motel room, the desert, and the mine all at once, overlapping like a double-exposed photograph. If you find this, if you're a ranger or a hiker or just someone who likes the peace of the woods, listen to me. The silence isn't a gift, it's a digestive process. If you see an elk with no eyes, don't look at it. Don't radio for help. Don't try to rationalize it, just find the zipper. Find the zipper before they find it for you. The staples didn't hurt. That was the most terrifying part. There was no sharp spike of agony, only a dull, rhythmic thud that resonated in the base of my skull, like a hammer striking a muffled bell. With every thwack, A piece of my autonomy drifted away. I watched, a detached observer in my own nervous system, as those needle-thin hands stitched a seam of heavy wire down my forearm. I wasn't in the motel anymore. I wasn't in the mine. I was in the between. That's what the voices call it now. The space behind the curtain of the physical world where the blueprints of the wilderness are kept. It looks like a forest made of glass and smoke. The trees here don't have leaves, they have memories. I saw a branch heavy with the sound of a woman laughing in 1924. I saw a root system tangled around the fear of a lost scout from the 60s. I am currently being pruned. You're fighting the integration, Miller said. He was standing nearby, though standing is a generous term. He was a flickering silhouette, a glitch in the visual field. He was holding a ledger made of human hair. It's the ego, Sarah. It's always the ego. You think you're an I, but out here, you're just a variable, a data point in the ecology of the unknown. I tried to move my tongue, but it felt like a heavy, wet slug. Why? I managed to croak. The Miller glitch paused. It tilted its head, and for a second, the mirror where its face should be reflected the night sky. Thousands of years ago, before the stars shifted. Because the Earth is hungry, and it has forgotten how to feed itself. We are the enzymes. We break down the complex sugars of human consciousness so the land can stay awake. If we didn't do this, if the silence actually became empty, the world would simply stop spinning. We keep the hum going. He gestured to the tower of antlers. It was pulsing now, a deep, bruised purple light emanating from the marrow. I could feel the frequency changing. It wasn't a hum anymore. It was a chant. A wordless, ancient vibration that spoke of the time before bones, the time when the world was just a screaming mass of gas and heat. They moved me then. Not by walking, but by folding the space around me. One moment I was in the glass forest. The next I was inside a restricted military zone, Area 4, deep within the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest. I recognized the concrete bunkers, the authorized personnel-only signs riddled with rust and something that looked like bite marks. But the bunkers weren't for soldiers. They were for the things that mimic us. I saw rows of them, incomplete versions of people I'd seen on missing posters. There was the hiker who vanished in the North Cascades last July. He was hanging from a hook by his shoulder blades, his skin still being cured to the right shade of tan. A group of the eyeless elk were circling him, breathing on him, their funeral lily breath acting like a catalyst for his transformation. They were building a new ranger. I saw my own uniform, the Loden green jacket, the brass badge, laid out on a stone slab. But it wasn't a jacket anymore. It was being fused with a layer of muscle and a network of copper wires. They weren't replacing me. They were upgrading the role. The Forest Service doesn't know, I whispered, the words bubbling through the black resin filling my mouth. The Forest Service is the mouth, Miller's voice echoed. They provide the perimeter. They keep the tourists on the trails. They ensure the harvest remains orderly. Why do you think the files on the vanished are so thin? Why do you think we tell you not to go into the caves without a partner? He leaned in close. The mirror face was gone. Now it was just a hole, a perfect circular void that smelled of the deep ocean. It's because a partner is just a second course. The elk with no eyes stepped forward. It was the one from the station, the Alpha. It didn't look like an animal at all now. It was a towering, spindly architect of bone. It reached into its own chest and pulled out a small, glowing object. It was a compass. My compass. The one Miller had left me. The needle wasn't spinning anymore. It was pointing straight down. At me. The transition is almost complete, the thing said, its voice a perfect replica of my own. You've been a very productive witness, Sarah. Your guilt over Caleb, it was delicious. The way you blamed yourself for not hearing him scream, that sustained a whole acre of the ribcage for 3 winters. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure behind my eyes. The zipper. I finally understood what they meant. It wasn't a physical thing. It was the seam between who I was and what they needed me to be. It was the thin line of sanity holding myself together. I felt their fingers, Those long, pale, multi-jointed fingers reaching for the seam. They were going to unzip my soul and wear it. No, I choked out. I reached for the only thing I had left. Not the gun. Not the badge. I reached for the memory they hadn't touched yet. The memory of the tragedy that drove me to the woods in the first place. The one I'd kept buried so deep, even the forest couldn't find the scent. The memory of the fire, the smell of the smoke, the sound of the door locking from the outside. I didn't flee to the forest to find peace. I fled to the forest because I was a monster too. As I flooded my mind with that dark, toxic truth, the frequency in the room changed. The green glow of the antlers flickered and turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow. The elk backed away, its throat fingers twitching in distress. "This is impure," the voice crackled, sounding like a skipping record. "The sample is contaminated. The yield is bitter." The Miller glitch began to dissolve, its silhouette stretching and tearing like wet paper. The laboratory, the bunker, the glass forest, it all began to vibrate with a violent, discordant shriek. I realized I wasn't being integrated. I was being rejected. I was a poison in their system. "You wanted a witness?" I screamed, the black resin spraying from my lips. "Then watch this!" I grabbed the antler tower. I didn't try to break it. I fed it. I poured every ounce of my hate, my shame, and my unspoken sins into the copper wiring. I became a surge protector for a hell I had spent a lifetime building. The explosion wasn't made of fire. It was made of silence. A silence so absolute it shattered the stone walls of the bunker. I felt myself falling, tumbling through the between, the staples in my skin tearing out one by one, leaving behind holes that leaked white light instead of blood. I woke up on the floor of my lookout station. The sun was up. The frost on the windows was just frost, crystalline and cold. The generator was humming a normal mechanical tune. I was wearing my Loden green uniform. But when I reached into my pocket, I found a small red child zipper. And when I looked in the mirror to wash the sleep from my eyes, I didn't see a ranger. I saw a face with no eyes, just smooth, velvety skin. I blinked and my eyes were back. But the color was wrong. They weren't brown anymore. They were the bioluminescent green of the things in the mine. I'm still at the station. I haven't radioed in. I haven't left. Because I can hear them. Not in the woods, not in the vents. I can hear them behind my own teeth. They're waiting for me to go back on patrol. They're waiting for me to find the next hiker, the next point last seen. And the most terrifying part? I'm starting to feel hungry. The wilderness doesn't just keep secrets, it keeps replacements. And I think it's time for me to go to work. The water is fine, after all. It's better than fine. It's necessary. I never believed in omens until the night the elk stood under the floodlight and stared at me with holes where its eyes should have been. I've replayed that moment so many times that it's no longer a memory. It's a place I return to. I'm back there every time I close my eyes too long. The hum of the station generator, the smell of diesel and pine sap. The way the light flattened the forest into something artificial and wrong, like a stage set built to trick you into thinking it's safe. My name doesn't matter anymore. It used to. I was a federal ranger for just over 16 years, assigned to a stretch of protected land that doesn't show up on most recreational maps. Officially, it was wilderness management. Unofficially, it was a buffer. A place you didn't go unless you had keys, clearance, and a reason you were prepared not to explain. I chose this job because I believed in distance. Distance from people, from noise, from the things I couldn't fix back home. My younger sister vanished when we were kids, walked into a tree line behind our house in Montana, and never came back out. No signs of struggle, no body, just absence, the kind that spreads through a family like mold. I thought wearing the uniform would give that absence a shape I could confront. Rules, jurisdiction, radios that worked. I was wrong. The first months at the station were quiet in a way that felt earned. Long patrols, weather logs, trail cams that mostly caught wind and deer. There were disappearances, but they were distant, hikers who strayed, seasonal workers who quit without notice. I told myself every forest has a margin of loss. You accept it or you leave. The elk appeared in late October after the first frost hardened the ground, and the nights started to smell like iron. I was alone on shift. That wasn't unusual. Staffing had been cut again, and the nearest backup was a 2-hour drive if the roads were clear. The radio crackled intermittently, like someone breathing with their mouth too close to the mic, but dispatch said it was atmospheric interference. At 0213, the motion sensor tripped outside the vehicle bay. I stepped out with my flashlight more out of habit than concern. Elk wandered close sometimes. Salt residue from winter trucks, warmth from the building. They were big but predictable. This one was neither. It stood just beyond the reach of the floodlight, tall enough that its antlers cut into the beam like scaffolding. Its body was intact, muscle moving under hide, breath fogging in steady bursts, but its face was wrong. The sockets where eyes should have been were smooth and dark, like burned wood. No blood, no damage. Just absence shaped like anatomy. I didn't raise my weapon. I didn't call it in. I remember thinking very calmly that it was sick. Disease did strange things to animals, tumors, infections. You rationalize or you freeze. The elk took one step forward. The sound wasn't hooves on gravel. It was softer, wet, like pressure being applied somewhere it shouldn't. I told it to move along. My voice sounded smaller than it should have, swallowed by the open space around the building. The elk didn't react. Its head tilted, not toward me, but toward the station door, as if it could hear something inside. Then it exhaled. The smell hit me a second later. Not rot, not manure. Burnt hair, faint but unmistakable, mixed with something metallic, like old blood on hot stone. I took a step back. The elk mirrored me perfectly, keeping the same distance, the same angle. When I shifted the flashlight beam, the light didn't reflect off its face. It just vanished into those sockets, absorbed. I don't know how long we stood there. The generator changed pitch, cycling. Somewhere deeper in the forest, something cracked. A branch or bone, I couldn't tell. Finally, without warning, the elk turned and walked into the trees. No rush, no sound of retreat. Just gone, as if the forest had closed around it deliberately. I filed an incident report the next morning and deleted it an hour later. There was no category for what I'd seen that didn't invite scrutiny I wasn't ready for. That should have been the end of it. The elk came back 3 nights later. This time it stood closer. Close enough that I could see steam rising from its body, even though the temperature had dropped below freezing. Close enough that the smell followed it, clinging to the air around the station long after it left. I noticed then that the ground beneath it was bare, frost melted in a perfect oval, as if heat radiated downward from its chest. I told myself it was coincidence, a thermal anomaly, a trick of perception. The 4th time, it scratched at the station wall, not with its antlers, with its hooves. The sound was wrong, too deliberate, metal on bone, slow, measured drags that vibrated through the wall and into my chest. Each scrape made the radio flicker, static surging and collapsing in uneven waves. I stood inside with my back against the opposite wall, counting the seconds between sounds like that would anchor me. When it stopped, there was no retreat noise. Just silence, so complete it felt padded, artificial. I opened the door after 10 minutes. The floodlight was still on. The wall bore shallow gouges, perfectly vertical, as if something had tested the structure for weakness. That was when I noticed the tracks. They led up to the wall. They did not lead away. Things escalated after that, not all at once. The forest has patience. Trail cams began to fail. Batteries drained overnight, even in sub-zero temperatures. Footprints appeared near the station that matched no known animal, two-toed, heavy, but uneven, like weight redistributed mid-step. The smell started appearing inside, faint at first, drifting through closed vents. I started dreaming of the elk standing in places it shouldn't fit. Hallways, bathrooms, the watchtower stairwell. In the dreams, it always faced away from me, head bowed, as if listening to something beneath the floor. I told no one. I was still rational then. Still believed silence was control. The night the missing call came in, that belief finally cracked. A static-filled transmission broke through at 3:41. A male voice strained, whispering coordinates that placed him deep in the restricted zone west of the station. A place marked on our internal maps as unstable terrain, old mining tunnels, sinkholes sealed decades ago. He said my name, not my call sign, my actual name. And in the background, beneath his voice, I heard breathing that did not belong to a human. I grabbed my gear and stepped outside. The elk was already there, standing directly in front of the door, its head lifted, its eyeless face pointed at me like it had been waiting. It opened its mouth, and something else spoke through it. Not words. Not yet. Yet. Just the sound of someone learning how. I should have run. I should have locked myself in and called for backup and burned every necessary to get out. Instead, I did what rangers do. I stepped into the forest and followed the thing that knew where I lived. I kept my light low as I followed it, more out of instinct than strategy. The beam stayed trained on the ground, on roots and frost-glazed stones, anywhere but the shape moving ahead of me. I told myself I didn't want to spook it. The truth was simpler. I didn't want to see its face again. The elk moved without sound, no snap of branches, no churn of undergrowth. It parted the forest the way a thought parts sleep, effortless, intimate. Every few steps it paused, not to look back, to listen. Each time it stopped, the air pressure shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a storm inhaling. The coordinates from the radio call pulsed in my head. I checked my GPS twice. The signal jittered, lagging several seconds behind my movement, then snapping forward to compensate. The terrain sloped downward, trees thinning, the ground softening into a mix of loam and old ash. I smelled sulfur, faint but persistent, layered beneath the pine and cold earth. We reached the edge of the restricted zone just before dawn threatened the sky with color. There were signs once, fences, warnings, but time and neglect had stripped them down to fragments. Bent posts, wire swallowed by bark. This land had been closed after a collapse took 3 surveyors and a piece of machinery that was never recovered. Officially, the tunnels were sealed. Officially, nothing remained beneath the surface worth finding. The elk stopped at the mouth of a depression in the ground that hadn't been there the last time I patrolled this sector. It wasn't a cave. It wasn't a sinkhole. It was too symmetrical for collapse, too smooth at the edges, like something had pressed down from above and left an impression. Cold air spilled from it, thick and damp, carrying the smell of wet fur and rusted metal. The elk stood at the rim and lowered its head. I waited for it to turn. It didn't. Instead, the ground beneath it trembled, a low vibration that traveled up my boots and settled behind my sternum. The radio on my shoulder crackled to life without prompting. "Still here," the voice whispered. "The same one from before. You came." My hands shook as I raised the radio. I asked for his name. No response. I asked if he was injured. The breathing returned, closer now, layered over the transmission like feedback. The elk stepped aside. That was the invitation. I wish I could tell you I hesitated longer. That training kicked in. That fear stopped me. What stopped me was the realization that the voice on the radio sounded like someone who had already waited too long. And beneath that, something else pressed at my thoughts. An image of my sister standing just beyond reach, always just out of sight, calling softly from somewhere I couldn't follow. I descended. The walls of the depression transitioned into a tunnel reinforced with old timber and rusted steel plates. Mining infrastructure, pre-war by the look of it. My light caught faded markings on the walls. Numbers, arrows, a symbol I didn't recognize, scratched deep enough to scar the metal. The air grew warmer with each step, breath misting less, the cold retreating behind me like something unwelcome. The soundscape changed too. The forest noise vanished completely, replaced by a low, constant hum that felt less like sound and more like pressure. It reminded me of standing near high-voltage lines as a kid, the way your teeth buzzed if you stayed too long. The elk followed behind me now. I didn't hear it move. I felt it. A displacement in space, like the tunnel was accommodating its presence by narrowing, stretching, reshaping itself around that wrong anatomy. I told myself not to look back. I failed after the third bend. Up close, its face was worse. The sockets weren't empty. They were deep, endless. The light didn't reach the back of them, just disappeared, swallowed without reflection. Its mouth hung open slightly, lower jaw slack, and inside I saw movement, subtle shifts like something adjusting itself behind the teeth. It closed its mouth when I met its gaze. The tunnel widened into a chamber that made no sense given the surface topography. Too large, too intact. Machinery lined the walls like equipment stamped with dates that didn't align, some older than the mine's operational history, others far newer. Generators, consoles, sealed crates marked with symbols I recognized from federal documentation but had never seen applied underground. Someone had been here long after the mine was declared dead. In the center of the chamber was a pit, not excavated, exposed. The earth around it was blackened, vitrified, like it had been subjected to extreme heat. I edged closer, heart hammering, and peered down. The pit dropped farther than my light could track, but I could hear something moving below. Slow, deliberate. The sound of mass shifting against mass, and threaded through it, faint but unmistakable, were voices. Not echoes, repeats. Fragments of speech, layered and distorted, as if recorded and played back through organic machinery. I heard my name again. My sister's. Call signs of rangers who'd transferred out years ago. A lullaby my mother used to hum when she thought no one was listening. I staggered back, bile rising. The elk stepped between me and the pit. For the first time, it made eye contact, if that's what you could call it. The pressure in my chest intensified, a weight that made breathing an effort. Images flooded my mind, not memories, but impressions. People stepping into the forest willingly, following familiar sounds, the land closing behind them, bodies not consumed but repurposed. Witness, the elk said. The word scraped its way out of the mouth like it had to be forced through unfamiliar anatomy. The voice behind it was layered, male, female, young, old, none dominant, all present. I demanded to know what it wanted. The question felt childish even as I asked it. To keep, it replied. To return. The chamber lights flickered on without warning. Harsh white illumination revealed more than my mind could process at once. Shapes embedded in the walls, human outlines pressed into stone and metal, faces frozen in expressions of terror or rapture, mouths open mid-scream or mid-prayer. Some wore uniforms. Some were children. All of them were incomplete. The elk turned toward the pit and lowered its head again. The ground vibrated harder now, the hum rising in pitch until my vision blurred. The radio screamed with static, then went dead. Something rose from below. Not fully. Not yet. But enough to cast a shadow that swallowed the chamber's light and made the embedded faces seem to move, to strain toward it. I backed away, every instinct screaming to flee, but the tunnel behind me had changed. Where there had been an opening, there was now solid rock, smooth and unbroken, like it had never existed. The elk faced me again. You came back, it said, and this time the voice was mine. Hearing my own voice come out of that thing broke something I didn't know was still intact. It wasn't imitation the way parrots mimic sound. It carried weight. Familiar cadence, the same flat exhaustion I heard every time I'd left a message on dispatch voicemail after a double shift. It knew the shape of me. That was worse than any threat. I backed away until my shoulders hit cold metal. One of the consoles, the screen flickered to life under my touch, though I hadn't activated anything. Lines of data scrolled past too fast to read, punctuated by still images that made my stomach turn. Trail cam photos, body cam footage, faces caught mid-motion, eyes wide, mouths forming words I couldn't hear. Each image was time-stamped. Each location tag corresponded to a missing persons case I'd either worked or read about. Some were marked closed. Others were marked returned. The elk took a step closer. I felt it before I saw it, a pressure wave that made the embedded faces in the walls tremble, stone flexing like muscle under strain. Fine dust sifted down, carrying that burnt hair smell, stronger now. You don't understand, I said, because that's what people say when they're trying to anchor themselves to logic. This isn't possible. You're sick. This is This is some kind of environmental exposure, hallucination. The elk tilted its head. That's what the first one said, it replied. Its mouth didn't move in sync with the words. The sound came from deeper inside, from somewhere behind the throat, layered with other voices trying to follow along. I thought of the sealed reports I'd skimmed over the years. Unusual animal behavior, disorientation, auditory phenomena in remote zones. They were always dismissed with the same phrases: stress response, hypoxia, sleep deprivation. I'd accepted those explanations because they kept the world manageable. The pit pulsed. Something massive shifted below, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound that set my teeth on edge. The hum intensified, resolving into a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound wasn't entering through them. It was already inside. Images flooded my mind again, sharper this time. A line of people walking single file through the forest at night, faces slack, eyes unfocused. The elk at the front, its antlers brushing branches that bent out of the way. The ground opening where they stepped, swallowing them gently, almost tenderly. I saw myself in the line. "No," I whispered. The elk's head dipped, not in denial, but in acknowledgement. "You're already marked," it said. "You came back to the station after the first time, after the second, after the sound started inside the walls." I flinched. I hadn't told anyone about that. The nights when I'd lain awake, listening to something move through the vents, something too large to be rodents, too deliberate to be settling metal. The mornings I'd found damp patches on the concrete floor beneath the radio rack, smelling faintly of fur and iron. "How long?" I asked. The question surprised me. Some part of my mind was still trying to establish a timeline to find the moment where escape might have been possible. The elk didn't answer immediately. Instead, it stepped aside, giving me a clear view into the pit. The light revealed more now. Not walls, but layers, strata of earth and something else intertwined, like roots grown around machinery. Shapes moved within it, not fully separate from the mass, faces surfacing briefly before sinking back in. Some were familiar. A seasonal ranger who'd gone missing during a snowstorm. A local hunter whose truck was found abandoned near a trailhead. And my sister. Her face emerged just long enough for me to recognize the scar on her chin, the one she'd gotten falling off her bike when we were kids. Her mouth opened, forming my name, and I screamed. The sound tore out of me raw and animal. It echoed through the chamber, triggering a cascade of responses. The embedded faces convulsed. The hum spiked into a shrill whine. The elk recoiled slightly, as if startled. For a moment, a precious, terrible moment, I thought I'd disrupted whatever equilibrium held this place together. Then the walls began to close. Not collapsing, constricting. The chamber narrowed, the ceiling lowering by inches, then feet. Metal groaned, stone flexed. The pit surged upward, its surface rising like a tide. "Stop!" I shouted, pounding on the console. Sparks flew, burning my palms. The screen glitched, freezing on a single image, the station seen from above, floodlight casting a harsh circle in the darkness. The elk stood in that circle, whole and watching, while something massive coiled beneath the ground around the building. "You don't stop it," the elk said. Its voice was quieter now, almost gentle. "You keep it company. That's the agreement." I understood then. Not fully, but enough. This wasn't predation. It was stewardship. The land didn't just take, it remembered. It needed witnesses to anchor those memories, to keep them from dissipating. Rangers, locals, people who knew the terrain, who would notice when something was wrong but stay anyway. People like me. The pressure in my chest intensified until spots danced in my vision. The air grew hot, sweat slicking my skin despite the underground depth. I tasted blood, coppery and sharp, and realized I'd bitten through my lip. "I won't," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. The elk stepped closer until its antlers brushed the ceiling, carving grooves into the stone. Up close, I could smell everything it carried. The forest floor, old fires, decay, and something sterile beneath it all, like disinfectant. "You already are," it replied. The tunnel behind me reappeared without warning, a dark gash in the chamber wall. Cold air rushed in, carrying the familiar scent of pine and frost. The sudden contrast made me stagger. "Go," the elk said. "You're not finished yet." I didn't ask what that meant. I ran. The tunnel spat me out into the forest as dawn finally broke, painting the trees in weak gray light. I didn't stop until I reached the station, lungs burning, legs numb. The building stood unchanged, solid, ordinary. No sign of anything beneath it. I locked the doors. I filed reports. I requested transfer. All denied, lost in bureaucratic loops that led nowhere. At night, I still hear it, scraping at the walls, breathing in the vents, and sometimes, under the floodlight, I see the elk standing just beyond the beam, waiting patiently for me to remember my role. I stopped sleeping after that. Not in the way people say it casually, like exhaustion became a badge. I mean, sleep became structurally impossible. Every time my body shut down, even for minutes, I woke with the certainty that something had moved closer while I wasn't watching. That vigilance hollowed me out fast. Food lost taste. Time fractured. Days passed without leaving marks. I tried recording everything. Audio logs, written notes, diagrams of the station walls, the ground beneath them, the places where the vents felt warmer than they should. Every record disappeared within 48 hours. Files corrupted. Pages went missing. Once, I found my own handwriting scratched into the underside of my desk, repeating a single phrase until the wood split. "Do not follow it again." I don't remember writing that. The elk stopped appearing for a while. That absence was worse than its presence. The forest grew too quiet, as if holding its breath. Birds avoided the clearing. Snow fell in odd patterns, melting in places where nothing should have been warm. The smell lingered, burnt hair, iron, seeping into my clothes, my skin. People commented on it when they came by for inspections. None of them stayed long. One inspector asked why the station was built directly over unstable ground. I told him it wasn't. He looked at me for a long time, then said, "That's not what the original plans show." He never sent his report. The radio started playing voices without incoming signals. Not all at once, one at a time, familiar tones. Dispatchers who'd retired, rangers who'd transferred. Sometimes my sister whispering fragments of things only we would know. I stopped responding. I learned that acknowledgement encouraged continuation. The final incident began quietly, the way all irreversible things do. I came back from a perimeter check to find the station door open. I know I locked it. I always locked it. The handle was cold, rimed with frost despite the mild temperature. Inside, the lights were on. The radio was humming softly, not static this time, but something almost melodic, a low oscillation that made my vision blur at the edges. The elk stood in the center of the main room. It barely fit. Its antlers scraped the ceiling tiles, dislodging dust that drifted down like ash. Up close, I could see that its body was changing. The hide sagged in places, stretched too thin over shifting mass. The sockets where its eyes should have been were no longer empty. Something moved in there now, slow and exploratory, pressing outward as if testing the limits of its mask. "You stayed," it said. I didn't draw my weapon. I don't know why. Maybe because some part of me understood it wouldn't matter. Maybe because the thing wearing that shape had already decided my trajectory. "You brought it here," I said. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. The elk shook its head. It was always here. The floor vibrated. A familiar pressure built beneath my feet, stronger than before. Cracks spidered across the concrete, oozing warmth. The smell intensified, layered now with decay, so fresh it made my eyes water. I realized then that the station hadn't been built to monitor the forest. It had been built to anchor something beneath it. The radio flared to life. Not one voice, but many, overlapping, syncing, resolving into a chorus that spoke with a single intent. Return. The floor split open, not violently, gently, like a mouth opening. Heat rolled up from below, followed by that impossible hum, now so loud it vibrated my bones. I saw the pit again, closer this time, the layered mass churning, faces surfacing and sinking. My sister's face was there, clearer than before, her expression calm in a way that terrified me more than fear ever could. "You don't have to be afraid," the elk said, stepping closer. "You know how this works now." I did. Witnesses don't escape, they circulate. They return in forms the land understands, shapes that can move between surface and depth, between memory and matter, shapes that can stand under floodlights and wait. The pressure on my chest became unbearable. I dropped to my knees, gasping, hands clawing at the floor. The concrete was soft beneath my fingers, pliable, warm. The smell filled my lungs. I don't remember screaming. I remember the sensation of being unmade carefully, deliberately, like someone disassembling a machine they intend to rebuild. Pain existed, but it was secondary to the overwhelming sense of being cataloged, memories sorted, voice sampled, shape evaluated. When I came back to awareness, I was standing outside. The station was whole again, the door closed, the forest quiet. Under the floodlight stood an elk. It lifted its head and looked at me, and for the first time, it had eyes. My eyes. That's why I'm recording this now, in fragments, on equipment that won't last much longer. That's why I stay inside at night and keep the lights on even when they flicker. I don't know how long I have before the cycle's complete, before the shape finishes settling. If you're listening to this because you've been assigned here, understand something clearly. The wilderness doesn't hunt randomly. It recruits, and once you've been seen, truly seen, it will always know where to find you.